Alright, this is Nathan Wagar with Fortitude Tactical Group. This is going to be our first new breakdown that I have done to date, as opposed to the other footage, which was kind of a re-release of material that I had done for a different organization. There's different terminology used. You might have heard it used in my podcast. This is all the new stuff that I've been working on. And for this particular breakdown, I'm going to be focusing on the shooting of a law enforcement officer. And due to the nature of the subject matter, it's not graphic per se, but it is a little bit disturbing. And so, more sensitive viewers might want to skip this particular one. But it is very useful for the pre-assault cues that it displays. And rather than focus on what the officer did wrong and his TTPs or whatever, I'm not going to do that. Partially because I don't know the full situation. It's just a clip. I'm watching it the same as you. And I've seen people break clips down and kind of presume to know what was going on past what the clip actually demonstrates. And then I found out the real situation later, and it's like they were way off. And so rather than demean his actions on a situation that I don't really fully grasp via video, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on what the bad guys do. Okay, we're going to focus on their cues. And then when the officer does something that ties in with our method, we'll use that as an example specifically without delving too much into who should have done what. And I think that'll be a more constructive use of this footage, and at the same time, not speaking ill of the dead, basically, So let's go ahead and take a look at this. CCTV highlighted the rider and the passenger on the motorcycle, but I want you to see if you can spot the cues on your own with the initial viewing and try and determine who's going to be the initial aggressor. So the primary aggressor, at least at first. And let's take a look at that. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Now, only that one rider is circled, but I want to point out that if you were somebody watching this footage to try and determine if somebody was with them, then I would pay attention to this front motorcyclist right here. And the reason why is because when he looks at the law enforcement officer that's walking in the distance, he starts displaying the pre-assault cue known as grooming, and it's almost as though he's acting like he's cold. If you look at the other cyclists, they're all wearing either short sleeve shirts or they have a long sleeve shirt like in the top left, and his sleeve is actually pushed up. So I seriously doubt he's cold. It seems like it's warm weather. So he's displaying grooming, and even though he jets out later, I would be willing to bet that he's with the group. And So he's not just a potential witness. I think he's part of that group. He has reason to be nervous. And so I wouldn't say that he's innocent. So you see the officer walk up to these guys. And you're going to see the guy in back, and he's looking off in the opposite direction. So he's displaying those cues of looking away, looking for potential witnesses, possibly escape routes, using peripheral vision, as we discussed in other previous ones. And I wanted you to watch the hands. See, the officer isn't quite in touching range, or we would call it rim distance in boxing. So he's basically a step away from touching his potential aggressor or opponent. The nearer person, he needs to be, careful of a first strike or anything like that. But the passenger in black, if he's too far away to hit you, then the only thing that can hurt you is the hand. So he needs to be looking for weapons access. Now, most weapons are going to be held in the waistline. Whether he has to lift the shirt up and dig around in there, whether he's carrying it kind of like what we would call like Mexican style, so he's got it stuffed in his pants like a bad appendix carry, or if he's got it stuffed in the back. But regardless, unless he's one of those, like those cool guy, like cartel bodyguards where they're reaching for their ankle holster, for the most part, the waistline is where they're going to go, at the very least, to pull their shirt up and pull it out. So you need to be watching the hands and watching the waistline. And we do see that in addition to looking around and displaying those pre-assault cues, he starts reaching into his waistline with his hand. And then you see the elbow jackknife. And the thumb index, and if you can't see the thumb index, the final one is the elbow jackknife. And the reason why the elbow jackknifes is because they're usually reaching in palm back. The thumb index is toward the center line, toward the weapon, and so that's what causes the elbow to do that. And it jackknifes even more when they pull the weapon out because they have to clear it. You'll see him look around again a final time. He has no reason to look in that direction because the officer isn't over there, but he's still looking around. The officer's kind of staying with his eyes on the front guy. It seems like he's asking about that front cyclist, and yes, he is indeed with them, it would seem. But he's not paying attention to the other guy, and you see that even though he's turned around, his elbow, you can still make out that jackknife. So you know when he turns around that it's going to be coming from that other side. So his right, the officer's left. Now, this is one of those situations where if you were following the hourglass threat matrix method, you're going to be using something that, it's just something I call it, but I call it zoning. And basically, you're going to minimize the access that the actual threat has to you. In this case, the biggest threat is the one with the projectile weapon, even though the other person is closer. So there's three ways that you can minimize access that he has to. You can increase distance. You can use other obstacles. Or you can use other people. Now, in the case of a law enforcement officer, you might not legally be able to do that. But let's say if it were me in that position and I'm not a cop, for whatever reason, if I found myself in that kind of physical sort of context, I would retreat probably back around that vehicle while using the nearest guy as sort of a human shield, to be perfectly honest. Because that's the only way he can get me is by shooting through his buddy. And then I'm using the vehicle to contour against as well until I can draw my weapon. Now, if you make the decision to close the distance and attack the gunman, as the officer did, then I actually, how he did it was pretty slick. And let's take a look at that. So the guy is looking away even though there's no reason for him to. The officer didn't tell him to walk that way. He's displaying the cue. He pops around. Now he's got the gun drawn. The officer kind of sees it. Now, because that near guy is in his way, he ducks. And even though the weapon is pointed right at him, he changes levels and moves at an angle to the left as he changes levels, and then he moves at an angle to the right. So it's like a zigzag pattern. And the reason I point that out is because something that I teach people, and then some of them, they kind of call bullshit on me. And they say, oh, well, if he has it out, he's just going to shoot you. No, not necessarily. And the footwork is actually very similar to something called the boxing blast, which is sort of a series of alternating crosses that takes you in kind of a zigzag. Paul Sharp teaches that in his MDoc multidisciplinary optimization coursework. And I teach that style of footwork as sort of a last resort. So the weapon's drawn and you need to go. It's kind of too late. This is sort of a last case, but you can't run because you're going to get shot. So you use that zigzagging kind of boxing blast footwork. And you can even do the boxing blast also if you want, just to kind of close that distance and make yourself as elusive and of a target as you can in kind of a nightmare situation. So you see him change levels and move to the left. The threat shoots over him and off at the angle. And then he zigzags into him and kind of does like a sort of a poor wrestling takedown. But I want you to note that the gun was out. It was pointed at him. And yet he was able to legitimately, connect with the threat and secure the arm. And the only way that went wrong is when he lost control of that weapon-bearing arm. And so that's why in our particular approach to gun disarms, I'm a big fan of grabbing my own clothes over the weapon-bearing arm just so I don't lose track of it. And even if we ended up on the ground or whatever, I'm not going to lose the weapon-bearing limb. Because once that happens, that's where the whole situation kind of, it took a turn for the worst. And yeah, it's a bad deal. So we're going to let you guys watch that one more time. Now, these pre-assault cues, this is not necessarily, these are kind of like, it's reference material. So this isn't how I would teach it in a course, just kind of randomly pointing out the cues. This is meant to go hand in hand with other people's material. And even though this is kind of like specialized teaching, at the same time, there's a lot of people that already do this, have been doing it for a long time. You've got Mick Coop, my buddy Mick Coop with C2 Combatives in the UK. He does some excellent work on this. If you're into kind of the protections and contracting kind of scene, he's a good guy to go to. Craig Douglas, formerly known as South Narc, with Shivworks. He's been doing this for I don't even know, like 2-3 decades. Depends on how old he is. I guess he'll get mad at me later. But Paul Sharp with his MDoc multidisciplinary optimization coursework has his approach to it. Locally, I have a buddy named Lee Sprague that's in protections, and he has his own versions and variations of this kind of stuff. And, look these guys up. The material is out there, and there's people that have been working on this with kind of a systemized approach. And, if you learn something different or kind of a different way of compiling it, that's cool. Use these videos as kind of a reference that just show you the cues so you can just watch them and get used to them. So when you drill it and when you're looking for it, this is kind of like training material on the go. And fit it in with your system. Fit it in with what you're doing. And so we can get this information out there on kind of a wider scale. So that's my breakdown for this one. I hope you learned something from it. And until then, stay safe.